I think I'm realizing now that most of my vice presidential knowledge actually comes from Hamilton, because I know that this issue came up in the musical. I can't, what was the song? It addressed that the vice president and the president were elected separately, and that was a thing.
I've never seen it.
I liked Hamilton.
I'm looking up the Hamilton lyrics where I know this comes up. Hold on. Oh, yeah. Okay. It's the song The Election of 1800. And then there's this allusion at the end to, it's crazy that the guy who comes in second gets to be vice president. And that I remember in that moment being like, wait, what? Like the guy who comes in second gets to be vice president? And that was, because there's I look forward to our partnership. Our partnership.
Musicals are the worst, aren't they? Man.
This is The Campaign Moment. I'm Martine Powers, the host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and writer of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're doing an extra bonus episode this week because we've seen a big development in Donald Trump's search for a running mate.
Right, and this is something that we've been talking a lot about in the newsroom. We know now that at least 8 Republicans have received paperwork to be vetted as potential running mates. Sources familiar with the process confirmed this late last week. And in an election year where so much feels like old news, the person who Trump ends up picking could be an actual game changer. Aaron, I know you have been watching this. And we also have with us today national political reporter Marianne Levine. She is on VP Candidate Watch. Marianne, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I just want to say that I was so happy to see Marianne's story on this because the vice presidential process is so much rank speculation. It's like, here are a bunch of people. We have no idea who's actually going to get picked. It's basically the decision of one person. We actually have something to base that on. And so I'm glad that we have that and we can actually talk about these things with a little bit more information today.
I feel like your head must be spinning trying to keep track of all these different candidates.
It's definitely tricky because as we've seen over the last 8 years, Donald Trump is someone who can change his mind quickly. He speculates himself. And I think in an interview recently, he said that this is a process that's in his head. So that can make reporting on this challenging and figuring out what exactly is going on. But to Aaron's point, it is interesting that we now have a more concrete development than just speculation or media appearances and trying to read the tea leaves of who's on the campaign trail.
So before we dive into deeper conversation, I think that it's important for us to just lay out who these at least 8 candidates are. And so I thought that maybe we could try to have a little fun with the introductions to each candidate and treat it kind of like speed dating, like one quick round for every candidate and just talk really briefly who they are, strengths and weaknesses. And
it is funny because when we talk about who Trump might pick for the vice presidency, it does sometimes feel like dating. It's like, do they have the right chemistry? Are they showing interest but not enough interest? And
yeah.
So it's not the worst. It's actually a pretty good analogy.
Well, and I have seen a lot of comparisons specifically to like The Bachelor or The Bachelorette because it's all happening so publicly and these people are kind of like prostrating themselves to the altar of Trump like in very public ways by going to the courthouse, or it feels like he's giving out his roses for national television.
Are you saying that the host of The Apprentice turns this into a reality television show to some extent? Is that what you're saying?
It's a shocking take that I have here, but yeah, that is how it feels. All right, so let's get started. And I think we're doing 1 minute for each potential running mate. And after that 1 minute, you're going to hear a buzzer sound that's the sound.
Oh, man, it's jarring.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's start with the 4 senators who made Trump's shortlist. And the first of the senators I want to talk about is Florida Senator Marco Rubio. Go.
So Senator Marco Rubio, of course, ran in 2016. Over the last 8 years or so, he's developed relatively close relationship with Trump in terms of just a working relationship. What he brings to the table is he is someone who's well known. Trump likes his appearances on television. He thinks Marco's good on TV, which is something important to Trump. He's young, charismatic. He's also someone who has foreign policy experience, and the Trump allies who like Rubio like the fact that he's also Hispanic and could potentially
the Latino vote
could broaden Trump's voter base among non-white voters. So those are some of the pros for Rubio. A major con for Rubio is the fact that he and Trump are both Florida residents, and so
which is the reason that's a problem, right? Is because if you have a president and a vice president from the same state, then that kind of like messes up your electoral votes.
Correct. And so the issue is, there you go.
We're going to talk more about that issue later.
Yeah.
That was a great start. I like the speed. Aaron, do you think you can take the next one? Ohio Senator J.D. Vance?
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, I think J.D. Vance is the one who is most in line with Trump's brand of politics. That wasn't always the case. He was a Trump critic back in 2016. But when it comes to like the real Trumpian kind of MAGA brand of populism, Vance has aligned himself with that, I think, more than anybody on this list. I mean, this guy literally wrote the book on what animates the Trump base, the hillbilly elegy back during Trump's first campaign. So,
that was a book that like every liberal was reading to understand how are Republicans thinking right now.
Yeah, and so Trump may look at him and see like, yeah, this guy gets it. The question from there is, does he think that J.D. Vance is actually a loyalist or is kind of playing the part, given the past criticisms? I also think a big drawback with Vance is that he won his race in 2022, his Senate race, but he did not do well. He was not loved by voters in Ohio. He far underperformed every other statewide Republican on the ballot. He underperformed Trump's performance in Ohio from 2 years prior. So if you're looking...
So what is he bringing to the table here is the question.
Yes, exactly.
Which we'll get into more. Next, I think we're going to talk about Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. Marianne, go.
Tom Cotton is someone who has been kind of a later emerging contender in the deep stakes process. He's a fairly young senator. He's popular on conservative media. He is someone who's pretty hawkish on foreign policy, and so could bring that experience to a Trump ticket. But I think the question with Tom Cotton is, what constituency would he bring to the Trump ticket that Trump doesn't already have? He's already pretty popular with conservatives. And so I think the question for Tom Cotton's candidacy would be what's the added value here? But he is someone who represents a younger generation. He was very young when he was elected to the Senate. He's popular among establishment Republicans as well. And he has kind of a more traditional Republican background.
Mm-hmm. Great. We beat it by 6 seconds.
Still have some, can I throw something in since we still have some time?
Sure.
Tom, people didn't notice this at the, oh man, can I still say it? People did not notice this at the time, but Tom Cotton said some pretty awful things about Trump after January 6th. He said, quote, "It's past time for the president to accept the results of the election, quit misleading the American people, and repudiate mob violence." I wonder if Trump is going to pick somebody who like really kind of said these things about January 6th and wasn't the most prominent election denier back then. I just think that's a significant factor here.
I was way over time, Aaron, but I will forgive it here. Okay, next is South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. Aaron, why don't you go for that one?
Tim Scott might be the most pragmatic pick for Trump. I think he's the guy who has a good reputation with pretty much all parts of the party. Obviously, picking a black running mate would appeal to Trump. It seems to appeal to Trump, given that 3 of these 8 candidates on this list are black candidates. I think with Scott, the potential big problem is that his own 2024 campaign really didn't do much. We saw other candidates get a little bit of traction, at least. You know, nobody was really threatening Trump as the race went on, but Scott's campaign was very much an also-ran campaign. It didn't get a whole lot of traction. And I wonder if the Trump campaign is going to be confident with him taking the stage on that VP debate, really driving the message. Trump seems to be happy with his performance as a surrogate.
Trump just seems to like him a lot.
Yeah,
and
I
has
think
talked about how Scott has been a better candidate for Trump than for himself.
Exactly. But I think that, you know...
We're done.
Sorry.
We're coming back. We're coming back. Okay, so we're halfway there through with 4 candidates. On to the next 4. We are going to have next up Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York. Marianne, go.
So Elise Stefanik has been a very prominent defender of Trump. She's on cable news a lot. I think that the argument for Stefanik would be that she's young. She's a young woman, so could help, in theory, bring more suburban women back to Trump. But I think that the downsides for Stefanik might be name recognition. She's not someone who people broadly know. She also was previously, like many of these candidates, a Trump critic as well. But
has really flipped on that and is like seems like such a loyalist at this point.
She's a staunch defender of Trump. She was someone who really came around to him during his first impeachment. That's kind of what a lot of people see as the turning point for Stefanik. But yeah, she's someone she's a good fundraiser. She was out on the trail with him in New Hampshire. And the pro for her is that could she bring in more women to the party? Does she have?
Because right now she's the only women on this list of 8.
Yeah, and does she have a slightly more moderate stance on abortion than, say, like Tim Scott or some of the other candidates?
Oh, 2 buzzers.
They're not going to let you break the rules here. So next we have Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida, who I have to say I had barely heard of before a few days ago. Aaron, tell us a little bit about Donalds.
Yeah, I think this is certainly a sleeper pick. You don't often see House members picked. We had Paul Ryan, who, of course, was House Speaker, but Byron Donalds is kind of a backbencher. He's not a party leader or anything like that. I do think that he has some appeal to all parts of the party. He's got ties to the House Freedom Caucus types, but he seems to be appreciated by establishment Republicans as well. He got a little bit of support from kind of both sides of the party when he was kind of an also-ran candidate for House Speaker last year. He is the most inexperienced candidate on this list, though. He's been in the state house in Florida for 4 years, been in Congress for less than 4 years. Mm-hmm. It would be a big step up for him. He also has some past legal problems from decades ago when he was a young adult. There was a drug possession charge, a bribery charge. He took part in a diversion program for the first one and had the latter one expunged. I think that there is a question of can he withstand the scrutiny that comes with this?
He also has the Florida issue that Rubio
The Florida
has.
issue as well,
mm-hmm.
Yes.
I just have to say that you guys are doing a great job with this whole speed dating concept, and you're fitting a lot into your 1 minute. Next, we have a name that I did not think was going to come up again, and that is Ben Carson. He was already a member of Trump's past cabinet, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Marianne, tell me about why Ben Carson is on this list. Go.
Well, it is true. We have not seen Ben Carson quite as much as some of these other candidates. I think the argument for someone like Ben Carson, one, is he would also help bring in Black voters. Again, Trump campaign's really trying to make inroads with non-white voters this cycle. There's also this idea, too, that Ben Carson is older. He's not someone who would be vying to be president in 4 years. And so I think there is an argument to be made about someone who is not constantly trying to potentially think about their personal next step while they're
not
serving
seeing this
Trump.
as a stepping stone to becoming
but kind of
president.
an end to their career. So I think that that's probably the argument for Ben Carson. He's obviously very popular among evangelical voters, who Trump is also popular with. So I'm not sure how much more that's going to add, but he is a surprising pick.
And finally, we have North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. What can you tell me about him in 1 minute? Go.
If you had told me a year ago that he would be one of the 8 finalists for Trump's VP or one of potentially 8 or more finalists, I would have laughed at you. I think most people would have laughed at you. This is a guy who didn't even make it to the starting line as a presidential candidate. But what we hear and what we see in this reporting is that he and Trump seem to have very good chemistry with one another. Trump seems to like him. A lot of that, I think, could potentially be owed to the fact that Burgum is also a very rich guy. There is some reporting, I think, from the Wall Street Journal that suggested that Trump sees Burgum as a potential avenue to wealthy donors who could help him out. I mean, this is a guy who spent $28,000 for every vote he got in his own presidential campaign. He is willing to spend some money at it.
Like if you broke apart by vote the amount of money that he spent on his campaign, it's $28,000 per voter.
I literally did the math on this. If he got about 500 votes because he dropped out before Iowa, and he spent about $15 million, so $28,000 per vote. The man has some cash.
Okay, that was the buzzer there, but I do want to know more about this guy. So, Marianne, I'm just curious, what is your take on the appeal of Burgum?
I think there are a few reasons why Burgum's getting a lot of attention. First of all, he's with Trump in a lot of places. He was with him at the Wildwood rally in New Jersey. He was with Trump at the courthouse during the New York hush money trial. And to Erin's point, he is someone who is seen as having connections to donors and connections to the tech world and people who are wealthy and who are self-made. And he is someone who fits that category. So Burgum made his money off of this company called Great Plains Software that Microsoft eventually acquired for $1.1 billion in 2001. There's also some similarities with Pence here in the sense that Burgum is someone who has experience. He's been a governor and he could walk into the job of the presidency on day one. That's some of the arguments that people have for Burgum. Now, some of the cons potentially are Burgum did sign a really restrictive abortion ban in North Dakota, and that is something that Democrats will be more than happy to hit him on.
And kind of at odds with where Trump is right now, where the way that he is addressing the abortion stuff is like states' rights, like let every state decide what it wants to do on abortion. And
Burgum has said that it should be up to the states, and he did say that during his presidential race, but of course, Democrats will see this as a very ripe target for them to target Burgum. There's also the question of which base does Burgum expand, and does he appeal to Midwest voters? What additional voters would Burgum bring to the table here?
Yeah, I think that's a good factor to isolate here because in these key states, in the Midwest, there aren't a huge bench of Republican potential, statewide candidates. The only other Midwesterner on this list is J.D. Vance. And Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania are going to be hugely important. These are the Biden firewall states. So the concept, at least, of picking a candidate from that region of the country, I think has to have some appeal to the Trump campaign.
Though I do think it's interesting that none of these candidates are from Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and though I would point out that there's one person who's not on this list who you could make a very clear case would boost the number of people who would want to vote for him, which is Nikki Haley. I mean, she is no longer running for president, and yet people are still voting for her in primaries. And there was this question that seemed like it was lingering for the last couple of weeks of could Trump actually pick her as a running mate? She came out and said, as much as I was critical of Trump during the campaign season so far, I will, in fact, vote for him in the election. And that seemed like it was sort of hewing toward, maybe could she be the VP pick? But it sounds like Trump cares about loyalty, and she clearly has not passed the loyalty test.
Yeah, I mean, based on our reporting, it sounds like a lot of donors would want to see Nikki Haley join the Trump ticket. I think they feel like she would be comforting to a certain base of voters who obviously supported her in the Republican primary, but who don't like Trump. And I think a lot of Republicans think that that would be a unifying ticket. But Trump has privately described her as disloyal, and it seems pretty unlikely, at least at the moment, that he would pick her as his vice president. He did a recent interview last week where he bragged about how he won her home state when he was asked about Nikki Haley. So it doesn't seem like he's on the path to wanting to bring her in and have her be his running mate.
I think the Haley question kind of highlights the central dilemma for Trump in this pick is, does he go with a pragmatic pick or does he go with a loyal pick? Does he pick somebody who's going to help him win this, or does he pick somebody who is going to be a governing partner that is never going to question him or do what Mike Pence did after January 6th?
I want to talk more about the loyalty test and who on this list is going to pass it. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll get into that and also what we know about how much this VP pick could sway the election. We'll be right back. Marianne, I thought what you said earlier was really interesting about how much these VP potential picks are about who would actually be beneficial to Trump and how much of it is who in Trump's head vibes the best. And he has his own kind of set of standards of what he wants in a VP that I think in some ways is distinct from what would actually help him.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about loyalty, but can you explain a little bit more, when we say who's passing the loyalty test, what does that mean to Trump?
I think what that means to Trump is who's out there on TV defending him, who is going out to fundraisers and getting donors to come and support him. I think, and it's also who is not questioning him, who is not criticizing him. I think for Trump, loyalty is basically accepting what he is saying at face value and going out there and defending him and showing how much you're willing to fight for him. And I think we saw a lot of that with the New York hush money trial, where many of the potential vice presidential contenders went up to court to defend him. They echoed his statements saying that this was a weaponization of government. They echoed the false claim that this was an effort that was in coordination with the Biden White House, which is not something that we've seen evidence of. And so I think it's the extent to which people are willing to, A, reiterate what he's saying, and B, defend him at all costs.
Yeah, I think the thing that we talked about Mike Pence a little bit, it fell apart between the two of them on January 6th. But before then, Mike Pence was an exceedingly obsequious vice president for Trump. It became clear that that's what the job demanded. I think it's so important for Trump to see people on TV, but it's also important for them to be willing to say things that maybe go against their better judgment. So we see Elise Stefanik go on TV putting forward the conspiracy theories about the Mar-a-Lago search and things like that. He's very big on election denial. Some of these candidates have not been as big on election denial as maybe he would like them to be. He wants them.
And which ones have failed the election denial test for Trump?
I mentioned the Tom Cotton comments after January 6th, where he said that Trump was misleading people. Marco Rubio is not the biggest election denier in the world. He was kind of quiet in that period. J.D. Vance is somebody who is much more on board with those kinds of things. So the question is how much is he emphasizing that these candidates say there's hundreds of thousands of illegal votes, and how much is he just demanding that they say the election result wasn't legitimate?
Interesting. But I do want to talk also about who would actually be most helpful for Trump outside of who Trump actually wants for himself. We talked about the potential benefits for having a woman candidate. And as I said, Stefanik is the only woman on this list. But I want to talk also about Tim Scott, Byron Donalds, Marco Rubio, the idea of having a person of color as the running mate. How beneficial could that be for Trump?
I think it's something that could be pretty beneficial to Trump in the sense that the Trump campaign right now is very focused on wanting to expand its base of non-white working class voters who support him. And I think that that is a trend that they really want to seize on. I think, for example, Trump was out in Nevada and he's making a play for Latino voters out there. And I think Biden has seen a decline in support among non-white Latino voters. And that's been a bigger decline than his support among Black voters. But I think that that's something that the Trump campaign sees. They see that as a potential opportunity. And they think that someone like Marco Rubio or Tim Scott or maybe even Byron Donalds could help solidify with that trend line that they're seeing.
Yeah, and to the extent that this pick could help Trump lock in those gains that he's seeing in polls among Black voters and Latino voters, it would be a huge, huge thing for him electorally. I think there's a lot of skepticism that those numbers are going to hold up over time. Trump is doing better among those voters than basically any Republican candidate in the last 50 years, according to the polls that we're seeing. So I would take this list as a potential acknowledgement that they see that as being a central goal to lock in those voters and potentially give them a pick that sends some signal about what he values in his campaign.
So considering how hard all of these politicians are working to be on this list and to be the star in Trump's eyes, I'm curious what you guys think is in it for all these contenders. Considering how publicly Trump turned on his former Vice President Pence, why would they want this job?
I mean, Vice President Pence had Trump supporters chanting for his hanging on January 6th. There was some talk when Kristi Noem was kind of imploding on her book tour of was this deliberately meant so that she wouldn't get picked? Was she doing this on purpose so she would take herself out of the running for this? I don't know if I buy into that necessarily, but certainly
that's some real four-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly right. Certainly you have to accept all that comes with being Trump's vice president. It's not necessarily a proud thing to do. You have to do lots of things that are say things you don't believe and praise him extensively like Pence did. You have to grovel. But, these are ambitious politicians. This is no question, something that would set you up for a potential run for president in your own right in 2028. Donald Trump would not be eligible to run again in 2028. And so the person who is his vice presidential pick would be set up for that. And so it's an easy enough thing for these candidates to get past, and kind of ambition takes over when it comes to things like this.
Yeah, and I think to Aaron's point, you have the potential to be the leader of the Republican Party in 4 years, which is not a lot of time. Or you have the age question. You have someone who is going to be 78 on Friday. And I think there's a real chance that whoever he picks, especially if it's one of the younger candidates like Rubio or Vance, that they will take on the mantle of the Republican Party. And for someone like Rubio, who's always wanted to be president, that's very appealing.
But again, doesn't that make him less appealing to Trump, knowing that if he picks Marco Rubio, like Rubio is spending every day of those 4 years thinking, what am I doing to become president next? Not what am I doing to support Trump? My impression is that Trump has a very sharp barometer for who is here for themselves and who is here because they actually like Trump. Speaking of Rubio, I did want to get back to the question that we raised a little bit earlier, which is the residency question, which was a part of the Constitution that I feel like I probably read in 5th grade when we had to read through the Constitution. And then I had no memory that this is a thing, that you can't have a president and a vice president from the same state. So what happens if he picks someone from Florida?
Under the 12th Amendment, the president and the vice president cannot win the electoral votes from a state where both of them reside. It's not a blanket prohibition, but you can't get the votes of Florida if you are both Florida residents.
So I think the short answer is no one knows. I've been looking at this question because I'm working on a broader Rubio story. And I think there's an open question of when would Rubio have to switch his residency?
Or Byron Donalds.
But the question is, when would he have to do it? I think there's an argument that some people would make that he does not have to change his residency until after the election. He could move to Wisconsin or D.C. or somewhere.
But also, why would Rubio move? I feel like Trump, who has residences in different states, it would make sense for him to just choose one of those other houses. Whereas Rubio is a senator from Florida. I feel like it's hard to make the case that he could just show up in Wisconsin and be a resident of Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, Trump has offered no indication that he is willing to move his residency. And I think that's best evidenced by some of his private comments that he keeps saying that Rubio has a residency issue, that he made some remarks at a fundraiser a couple weeks ago saying that Rubio and Donalds had a Florida problem. So I think the fact that he keeps saying that suggests that the onus would be on his vice presidential candidate to switch residencies.
Just figure it out.
So
is Trump going to move for little Marco? I don't know that that's going to be the case. It's not as big of a hurdle as some people may think it is. Dick Cheney, back when he was picked as George W. Bush's running mate, established residency back in Wyoming. He had actually moved to Texas, so there was a problem back then. It is more complicated now because Rubio is an incumbent senator. Establishing residency somewhere else is more complicated for him and for Byron Donalds. So I think it's something that they could deal with, but it is certainly a complicating factor.
Okay, so last question. We are expecting Trump to announce his running mate potentially at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee next month. So this is all going to play out pretty soon. But until then, what are you going to be looking out for? And who do you think is going to be the pick? If you were just putting a bet on this now.
I don't know if I would put a bet on it. It feels like the top 3 he's talking about, at least privately, are Burgum, Rubio, and Vance. So I'm definitely watching those candidates pretty closely, but it's hard to make predictions with Donald Trump. So I think I'm going to refrain from that because he could change his mind. And I think that the process is still pretty fluid. But curious what Aaron's thoughts are.
Yeah, I'm looking to see if these candidates are going to be even out there more than they have been before, campaigning for this job. Are they going to be on the Sunday shows towing the line on Trump's conspiracy theories about the Manhattan prosecution and things like that. Like how hard are they going to go after this? We saw Kristi Noem, basically going on the Sunday shows and arguing that Trump should pick a woman in some very interesting comments that you don't usually see from this. So once we get closer to that finish line, it becomes more real for these very ambitious politicians, and you begin to see them potentially doing some things that are intended to take part in this reality show and, be the apprentice for Donald Trump.
And I think there's questions, too, about the process. Like if people are going down to Mar-a-Lago for interviews, or are people getting more intense vetting questions? And I think those are some of the procedural steps that we'll also be looking out for.
To get a sense of what's going on inside Trump's head.
Yeah, in terms of getting more intense background checks and seeing that process narrow in terms of final interviews and all of that. But it's also possible that this is not going to be the traditional sweepstakes search process that we've seen in past years.
Aaron, I didn't hear your guess on who right now you think
I was going to say Rubio or Vance would be my completely uninformed. Again, this is in the mind of one person who is very unpredictable, but those are the ones that seem to make the most sense to me.
All right. Thank you guys so much for being here to chat about this today. This was a great bonus episode. Marianne, really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.
And Aaron, thank you as always. Excited to have you.
Thanks, Martine.
Marianne Levine is a national political reporter for The Post focused on the 2024 elections. And Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Renita Jablonski, and it was mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky. I'm Martine Powers. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode of the Campaign Moments. We'll be back in your feed this Friday with our regularly scheduled episode. See you then.